Hello, everyone. Eric here, and today I am excited to talk about logical positivism, AJ Ayer, verificationism. All these are going to be summarized here, and I want to talk to you about like why this was so exciting to philosophers in the 1930s when logical positivism really was in its heyday. And because once you understand what this can do, like what these sorts of translations that I'm going to talk about, these translations of sentences can do, it's like, oh wow, a lot of philosophical problems can just be dissolved, just go away. And so this was very exciting to philosophers in the 1930s. Now, I have to admit, to my great shame, or maybe not so much. Um, but this video has been very difficult for me to record. This is probably about my fourth or fifth attempt because every time I sit down to make this video and I'm reading the notes I have, I realize that there's something that I don't fully understand. And I am as I'm going through these graduate materials, I am not going to settle for half understandings. I everything I read, I want to really truly understand it. So, you know, it's maybe slower going than usual, because I'm not accepting these half measures, and so there was a few things I was a little confused about, and I really wanted to understand. And so I'm glad I did do this now though, because what's cool is now I get to bring it to you. Now I get to really hopefully help you understand why logical positivism was so exciting and what Ayer's talking about. Okay. So, what's going on here? So, Ayer's book is Language, Truth and Logic. And actually, hold on. Let me grab it. I realized too late that, like I wound up reading it off of my e-reader, and I realized a little too late I actually have a physical copy. So ugh, I missed the opportunity. I hate that. Because I much rather read a physical book. There's just something nice about a physical book. But anyways, so this book here, Language, Truth, and Logic, um, it's not so much an argument. It's not a philosophical argument so much as a manifesto, you could say. It's a manifesto for the logical positivism movement. What it does is it basically says, hey, if we analyze language in a certain way, what we'll find is that many philosophical problems, specifically those of metaphysics. I mean, Ayer is very anti-metaphysics. Like that's his whipping boy. If we analyze language in a specific way, things like metaphysics just dissolve. We can very clearly see that they're not really even problems at all in the first place. These metaphysical type problems, and like the way we need to examine language is we need to use language in a way that where sentences are verifiable. And this is where the term verificationism comes from. Verificationism is almost synonymous with logical positivism. It's kind of like the main thing. At least it's Ayer's main thing. You could definitely say. So what does this mean? Well, for a statement to be verifiable and therefore meaningful at all in the first place, according to Ayer, you have to have some set of observations, at least in principle, that could lead to you being able to say the sentence is true or false. So in other words, a meaningful statement is a verifiable statement, and a verifiable statement is one that can be tested empirically. So, something like a statement like from like astrology that Mars, the planet Mars, is associated with war, conflict, and masculinity. There's no real way to verify that sentence empirically. There's no scientific test you could do. There's no observation that you could make that would make that sentence that you could test the truth value of that sentence. And therefore, Ayer would say it's kind of meaningless. It's just a meaningless thing to say. Whereas something like, the favorite example, here it comes, the water bottle, saying something like, this water bottle is red. That's a meaningful statement because I can empirically observe whether the water bottle is red. Now, it's very worth it to note that if I say this water bottle is green, that is also a meaningful, verifiable statement. So, a meaningful, verifiable statement does not need to be true. It just needs to be testable. It just needs to be something that we can go out and look at the world, empirically observe the world, and see if this is true. So I could say this water bottle is green, and that's meaningful. It just happens to be false. Okay, so it can be both. Now there is one other class of statements for Ayer that are also meaningful, even though they're not so much empirically verifiable, and that's any sort of statement of like logic, any statement that's analytical, any statement that just leads to a tautology. So a statement like all bachelors are unmarried men. Well, that's perfectly meaningful. That's just a tautology. That's just an analytical statement, and an analytical statement is typically one that, or traditionally, is defined as one where the meaning is within the concept itself. So it's like what it means to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man. Basically, you can understand the concept without any sort of observations there's no context where this is wrong. It's just examining the concept itself reveals the meaning. Another one would be something like 3 plus 3 equals 6. Well, the meaning of the words three plus equals and six, just by examining the meanings of these words, this statement is obviously correct. You don't need to go out into the world to to verify this, as Ayer might say. It like the meanings of these words, or the truth value of this sentence is automatically contained in the concepts. It's not dependent on any observations. So that's what it means for something to be analytical. So the analytical statements for Ayer are just as meaningful as empirically verifiable ones. Okay, so, but the big idea here for Ayer is that any statements that don't fall under one of these two criteria are just meaningless. They're just meaningless. They don't mean anything. You're just spouting nonsense. Okay, so this is already you can already start to get a little bit of an idea of why this is a little exciting for philosophers, because a lot of these metaphysical debates. Let's take a classic one: does God exist? Very interesting. Everyone's interested in this metaphysical argument, this ontological argument. Um, I don't mean the ontological argument. I just mean like ontology as a whole, whether God exists or not, is an ontological question. Like it's very interesting, but it dissolves. It dissolves because there is no empirical meaning to the word God for Ayer. You can't break down this word into some sort of uh, set of empirically observable phenomena, unlike, say, the word dog. You know, I, I can kind of define a dog by its anatomy or its behavior, all sorts of these empirically observable facts about what a dog is. So anything we would go and say about something like God for Ayer would probably just be meaningless. Like it's because there's no way for us to verify it. Whereas something like dog, there's certainly a way to verify that things about dogs because they're empirically observable. So now, uh, an important distinction that Ayer makes clear, and this is only in the like I had to do a lot of research on this, and I realized, or I didn't realize, it was explained to me that this was only in the second edition, and this was actually a response Ayer was making to one of the contentions that I'll talk about later that I actually had when I was reading this. So one of the contentions was essentially, well, the principle of verification is not itself verifiable. It's kind of self contradictory, right? Um, What do you do about that? And what Ayer did is he made this distinction between a strong principle of verification and a weak principle. And so he comes by and he says, okay, so so originally I said that a statement that there has to be some set of empirical observations that would determine the statement's truth or falsity. And that's sort of the strong principle of verification. Like there is some observation or set of observations I can make that will absolutely determine the truth or falsity of a sentence. Well, this is a problem. This oversteps its bounds. Um, not at the very least, because there are these huge range of sentences that can only ever really be highly probable. They can never be like absolutely determined to be true or false. And probably the most famous example of these kinds of sentences are going to be inductive, like ones that are derived from inductive logic. So the classic example is the sun will rise tomorrow morning. Well, how do we know that the sun will rise tomorrow morning? Well, someone might ultimately say, well, we don't. It could fail to rise tomorrow morning. But the sort of traditional way we want to think about it is, the sun has risen every morning of my life so far. Um, I sort of have this really strong evidence based off of this pattern of the sun rising every morning since I've been born, which is going to be thousands of days at this point. Um, I just turned 40 a month ago, so I'm getting a little bit gray in my beard. I've seen a few sunrises at this point, but it's sort of our intuition to want to say, well, like we have a lot of evidence that the sun is going to rise again tomorrow because it's risen every day since then. Well, there's a problem with these kind of statements because it could be that the sun doesn't rise tomorrow. Maybe a black hole comes through our system, and there you go, no more sun, probably no more Earth for that matter. And and there's also maybe some everyday examples where we'd be very wise to question our inductive assumptions. The classic and humorous example is that the chicken, who by the farmer's hand is fed the feed every day for days, weeks, months, or maybe even years, would be very wise to question the his inductive his inductive reasoning on the day that the farmer's hand does not feed him but wrings his neck, fries him up on a pan. So there's actually good reasons sometimes to question our inductive reasoning, to question this idea of, well, this has been the pattern for so long that it seems like this will continue to be the pattern. Well, Ayer wants to say that in such cases there might be some set of empirical observations that are very relevant to the truth the sun will rise again tomorrow, but there is no set of observations you could ever have that absolutely determine the truth, that are going to absolutely determine the truth of that sentence, the truth of the sun will rise, tomorrow. Like I know, or I should say more accurately, I know the sun will rise tomorrow because obviously we can observe where the sun does rise tomorrow, and that will determine the truth of it. Full stop. But the sentence "I know the sun will rise tomorrow" is more accurate to what we're getting at here, because we're making this future prediction and saying, well, I know this to be the case. I know in the present that this will happen in the future. Okay, I mean, it's a technical clarification here, but it's actually kind of an important one. So because there is no set of observations that can completely confirm this sentence, I know the sun will rise tomorrow. It only reduces to ever being highly probable. It's highly probable that the sun will rise tomorrow. Um, because of this, the strong principle of verification oversteps. It's too much. Other statements of this sort would be statements about history, like Bismarck was the first chancellor of Germany. Um, it's like we have all sorts of written records and that's mostly what we have: written records, maybe a statue, these sort of artifacts that strongly suggest that Bismarck was the first chancellor of Germany. But there's nothing we can in the present day empirically observe that would completely settle the issue. It's just highly probable this is the case based off of the available evidence. Okay. So, that strong principle of verification goes too far. Instead, Ayer says the weak principle of verification does this job much better. And the weak principle of verification says that sentences or statements are meaningful if there are any observations that would be relevant to to its truth or falsity. So you can see how this is a little different, because it's clear that the fact the sun has risen every morning for all these days prior to tomorrow morning, um, that certainly seems at least relevant to determining the truth of the sentence. This, I know the sun will rise tomorrow. It's at least relevant to that. It doesn't determine it absolutely. It just makes it highly probable. But there are sentences that are at least relevant to determining the truth, as evidence for that statement being true or false. Got it? So that's the difference. Now, that being said, and this is where things start to get really exciting, because now Ayer is going to introduce um, a method for dissolving a lot of philosophical problems and for clarifying a lot of our very ambiguous language. So, the third chapter, he starts with a distinction between explicit definitions, which are very much dictionary like definitions. It's just where we substitute a symbol, a word, for another word, for some synonym, versus definitions in use, which clarify a symbol's meaning by exposing its logical structure, but by not using the symbol, not using just some synonym for it, but expose the logical structure of what's trying to be said. I'll explain. So, for example, if I wanted to define the monopoly property boardwalk explicitly, use an explicit definition, I might say something like boardwalk is the most expensive monopoly property. Now, what's relevant here is that this synonym can simply replace the term boardwalk in any place it would otherwise be used. So instead of saying, I'm about to land on boardwalk or I'm about to buy boardwalk, you could replace the symbol boardwalk and instead insert the explicit definition, and it always makes sense. So instead of saying, I'm about to land on boardwalk, I would say, I'm about to land on the most expensive monopoly property, or I'm about to buy the most expensive monopoly property. It's like explicit definitions have this property of being able to just replace to just replace the symbol wherever it's used, the symbol, the word, or whatever it is. So get it? I think that's pretty simple. Explicit definitions are straightforward. Now, in contrast, definitions in use, which are going to be the sort of exciting part of all of this, they don't use the symbol or define it in terms of just some synonym, but instead define the symbol in terms of its general logical structure. So instead of saying boardwalk is the most expensive monopoly property, what I might say instead is there is exactly one X, such as that X is a monopoly property, and X is more expensive than any other monopoly property. Okay, I mean that's a little wordy. I'll repeat it just once here. The, Instead of saying boardwalk is the most expensive monopoly property, I would instead define it in use as there is exactly one X, such that X is a monopoly property and X is more expensive than any other monopoly property. Okay. Now, this definition, what you'll notice here is this is not the same as an explicit definition, because I cannot substitute this for any use of the word boardwalk. In fact, I didn't even define the word boardwalk. I didn't even do that. Instead, I basically just defined an X, just a bound variable. So I'm not even defining boardwalk. I'm defining a bound variable, this bound variable X. It won't do to say I'm about to land on X instead of I'm about to land on boardwalk. It doesn't work. I'm about to land on X could be any of the monopoly properties. I mean, if you want to even go even broader, you could say I'm about to land on X could mean I'm about to land my airplane somewhere. But if you can find it just the context of boardwalk, or just context of monopoly, it still doesn't work, so it's not an explicit definition. It doesn't work the same. The point is that the word boardwalk and any mere synonyms disappear from the definition. They're gone. And if you're still confused of why this is so exciting for philosophers back in the 1930s, I will now show you. So, so the problem with explicit definitions is that they fail to solve many philosophical problems. They're not helpful. Let's take an example. And I'm going to release a video on this probably tomorrow. I'm going to go over Quine's famous paper on what there is, because a lot of what I'm saying here is very related to this paper, and we're going to go over how there's some things I'm going to leave out here because I'm trying to demonstrate Ayer. There's things about Quine's paper that are really interesting about how he turns proper nouns into predicates and stuff like that. But I want to go over Quine's paper explicitly, maybe as a thing tomorrow. But today I'm going to just use some examples from this paper in order to demonstrate what Ayer is saying. Okay, so let's take some examples from Quine's paper on what there is. So Quine argues in this paper is that some people have argued that God must exist. Okay, famous. It's a very, very fun subject. Everyone likes to argue whether God exists or not. But some people have argued that God must exist because to even have the property of non-existence, God must exist to have the property. So it's just a contradiction then to say that God doesn't exist. Because he would have to exist in order to have the property of non-existence. Well, to be honest, Immanuel Kant already kind of addressed a lot of these issues, but Quine does his own great job here. So what Quine notices is that this problem isn't limited to God. It can also be applied to, say, mythological creatures like minotaurs or Pegasus, and really it generalizes into any entity that supposedly does not exist. And so it leads to this seeming paradox that Quine labeled Plato's beard. And it's this philosophical problem about the ontological status of supposedly non-existent objects. So the problem is that explicit definitions do nothing to solve this problem. If you take the sentence "Minotaurs do not exist" and merely define the term Minotaur as the creature with a head of a bull and the body of a man, and then you replace it in the sentence, you get the creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man does not exist. That's not helpful because it leaves the logical structure of the sentence intact. The problem just remains. You haven't solved the problem of Plato's beard. So instead, and this is where it's exciting. This is where Ayer was so exciting to philosophers in the 30s. Instead, we can use a definition in use, and if we translate to a sentence that's an in use definition, it becomes something like, there is some X such that X is a creature, and X has the head of a bull, and X has the body of a man, and X cannot be found in the labyrinth on Crete. Or we might translate exists into X cannot be found on Earth, or X cannot be found in this universe. Depends on how broadly we wanna speak here. It doesn't ultimately matter. We're saying X cannot be found, in the labyrinth on Earth or in the universe. That's what we mean when we're saying that it doesn't exist. Got it? Now, this definition completely dispels the philosophical problem, because when we and I'll repeat it because it's wordy. It's better on paper than it is in the spoken word. I will admit. The sentence was, there is some X such that X is a creature, X has the body, or X has the head of a bull, and X has the body of a man, and X cannot be found in the labyrinth on Crete. Okay, so the magic of this is now the truth or falsity of the sentence isn't vague. It's now completely dependent on an empirical observation, whether this sentence is true or not. So can we can then ask, can we go to the Isle of Crete? If we go to the labyrinth on Crete, um, which I think is still like a real place, isn't it? I hope so. It doesn't matter. Let's just pretend it is, whether it is or isn't. I just realized this example might itself kind of have some confusions in it, but yeah, whatever. Uh, can we go to Crete? Can we go to the island of Crete and find something that is a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man? Can we do that? Can we? Is there some empirical observation that we can make on the island of Crete where we observe this creature and we find no, we cannot. And so this is how we can make the sentence, the Minotaur does not exist, unambiguous. And you could probably see pretty easily where this then starts to dissolve philosophical problems like God exists or God does not exist. Well, because when you try to translate the word God into these logical elements, you cannot translate it into empirical logical elements. So notice what we said about the Minotaur is that it's a creature, and I mean that one maybe even a little ambiguous, because empirically defining what is a creature versus a non-creature might itself be a little confusing. But put that aside for a minute. The other two criteria are very, very clear here, or the other three criteria are very empirically clear. It has the head of a bull and has the body of a man, and it can be observed in the labyrinth on Crete. Okay, like those are very empirically concrete. They're very empirically easy to understand. But the problem with a philosophical problem like God is it doesn't break down into these individual empirical observations that can then be put together into this kind of a sentence with this kind of logical structure, and where these atomic logical elements are broken down, and put together using logical connectives like if then and or, all the things that you learned in your logic class. So and this is and this sort of way of looking at things is actually very important to Ayer. Here, readjust myself here, because the way Ayer even conceives of things like perception, it's very clear when going through the book. This is how he basically thinks about it. Um, Ayer thinks of something like perception as just looking at raw individual elements and putting them together into one logical structure, just like we did with the Minotaur. It's has the head of a bull and the body of a man. These are two individual perceptions. Head of a bull, that's one individual perception. Body of a man, that's another individual perception. And what makes this one object, what makes it this one thing, is that these two things are in proximity to each other. The head of the bull is on top of the body of the man, and that creates one single entity. So for Ayer, this is how perception works, and this is how we cognize objects, like the water bottle. You know, I I could define the water bottle in use as, um, there is there is some X where X is colored red, and X has a screw cap, and X, you know, opens up, and etc. I could break it down into these individual perceptions, into these individual elements, and then put them all together in this logical structure of and. And and this is what Ayer does when he talks about uh, like collections of sense data, of these individual sense data being put together into one logical structure to form a cohesive object. Well, the biggest objection I have to Ayer in this sense is, and this comes from perhaps being at least a little bit familiar with later philosophers, But also, Ayer really tries to argue against Kant, but I think Kant just kind of has him beat on this because um, Kant is actually kind of correct here. But the problem I see here is that the problem is not purely linguistic; it's also cognitive. Um, because Ayer seems to interpret objects this way, I think he's really missing an important element. And the important element is that the mind interprets objects with a pre-existing set of cognitive frameworks, um, like most of which just seem intended on like effectively fulfilling the will. That'll have to be a whole other video though. Like the will as like I kind of want to take Schopenhauer and redeem Schopenhauer in a lot of ways using a lot of more modern ideas about metaphysics, because metaphysics today is often defined in terms of like organizing principles, like these sort of organizing narratives, these overarching narratives that we have that aren't necessarily ontologically true or ontologically the case, but are more like how we tend to think about things, how we tend to organize our cognitions, organize our thinking about things. Well, I think the sort of the most generalized metaphysics is the will, and it's because all of our cognitions, all of our mind's cognitions, seem directed at this process of uniting us with what the mind finds desirable and separating us from what the mind finds undesirable. That's what the will is. This sort of overarching goal is applicable in all contexts with the mind, in all contexts. And so this is like the central organizing principle of the mind that governs over all other organizing principles. It's the transcendent organizing principle. Okay, I want to do a whole nother video on that. That's a whole nother topic. I am not ready to fully release that because that's something that I'm gonna have to do a little more get going with a little more rigor. But anyways, what I'm saying, what I'm my objection to Ayer here is a little easier here in that cognition is not this passive or neutral process. It's not that the mind is just taking in these individual elements of an object and therefore forming a cohesive object. No, that like which elements of the world that the mind decides to even put together in the first place. Like when I look at this water bottle, my mind is drawing an invisible line around this thing as opposed to all the rest of the things around it. And what is it like? What is it that determines where this line is drawn? Why does my mind draw a line around this rather than these together? This is my coffee, by the way. Okay, yeah, I got two of them. I got water and I got coffee. So, well, like, why does my mind like? Yeah, there is this collection of individual observations here. The Geyer wants to say, sure, but what is the principle behind my mind putting those things together rather than all the other things that are around this water bottle? What makes that determination? And you cannot reduce that determination. I mean, Ayer kind of he tries to talk about something like this in Language, Truth, and Logic. He tries to say, well, basically the proximity is what does it. But if that's the case, that doesn't explain why we put cats in the same category, because each individual cat is not necessarily in proximity to other cats. So it's like if we're describing cognitive principles, we have to like to me it seems really obvious, and it looks like the research into cognitive science really bears this out. And most subsequent philosophers that became aware of what I'm explaining here seem to agree that part of what the mind does is it has these pre-existing frameworks that it is imposing upon what it sees. And so we it's not always possible to divide the world, um, in this neat way that this very very neat way that Ayer wants to do. You can't just pick it apart by these individual observations and put them together into a logical format. Sometimes you can. The and we can even bring in a little bit of the what is going forward will be the probably the primary line of thinking that is going to object to Ayer, which is the common or the ordinary language philosophy, which is going to come out of Wittgenstein's ideas about language games. You know, as opposed to Ayer, who wants to create like a formal language, and he even explicitly says that the interest of philosophers is this formally defined, unambiguous language. Well, ordinary language philosophers in that movement, like throughout like the 1950s, are going to uh, push back against this, and they're going to go into much more in-depth explanations and examinations of just our ordinary language, how we use language in a natural way throughout all these different kinds of contexts. Well, what I would say here is I would have very similar objections to Ayer, in that a lot of our language is so contextual and is the different sorts of language games we play would make certain language actually quite meaningful, even though it's not necessarily empirically verifiable, depending on the language game that we are playing. So, I think a lot of the ordinary language philosophers, like Wittgenstein's objections, are going to be quite quite voracious. Quite well done. So I would agree with a lot of Wittgenstein's and the ordinary language philosophers' objections. But but yeah, so I would say that's sort of my primary objection is that I still conceive of things in a more or less Kantian way, where the mind comes with pre-existing frameworks, and there's other philosophers that are kind of build on a very similar theme, where our language is unavoidably uh, what's the word, and who says it? I can't remember. It's not Austin, is it? Our language is basically unavoidably embedded in theories. Um, Actually, that might be what am I thinking of? That might be Van Frossen that I'm thinking of. I can't remember. But basically, our language becomes it comes pre-embedded in context, and it's unavoidable. We can't just break down language into these individual empirical parts like Ayer wants to do, or like the verificationist wants to do. We can't do that, because even pointing at an object and saying, this is red, for these philosophers often comes, like the language for that comes embedded in some form of context, in some form of pre-existing structure. There, pre-existing assumptions, pre-existing frameworks, and you can see though how this would have been exciting before all these objections came up. That we could break the world down in this way. It's very similar to what I've explained in my video about levels of abstraction. You know, these sorts of direct observations. Red is far less ambiguous than uh, Batman acts in the name of justice. Like, how do you even talk about that? It's very ambiguous what justice means in that frame. You know, so so you can see where this would be exciting, but there are objections to this, objections that I think are on point. Um, I certainly have these sort of Kantian objections, and Ayer tries to avoid them, and I don't think he does so successfully. And then the last thing is that I think the verification principle itself is is not verifiable. It's kind of self contradictory. Like, there's no empirical verification for the sentence. The only meaningful sentences are ones that, in principle, have some sort of relevant empirical observations that could determine their truth, or that could be relevant to determining their truth or falsity. That's very wordy, but like you get the point. There's no empirical observation I can go and make to determine whether such sentences are meaningful. Like the meaningfulness of sentences is not it's not it's not something that's empirically testable, empirically verifiable. So it kind of contradicts itself. It eats itself. And this was actually a common objection that was raised almost immediately after Ayer excuse me, after Ayer published. So I'm not the only one that has made this objection. So anyways, that's a little bit about logical positivism and why it was so exciting, and why the conversation around it lasted for probably about 30 years, and even now still generates a lot of philosophical conversation, because it came really close to eliminating a lot of philosophical problems that some people maybe have some emotional attachments to, like God. So you could see where this would be exciting for some people and maybe a little threatening for others, which is a different kind of excitement. And yeah, that's where it lands. So I made it through this time. Holy cow! I made it through the video. I did it. I explained a little bit of language, truth, and logic. I'm amazed. This is like my 5th time trying. So anyways, if you like my content, I like it when you like it, and I like it when you subscribe to it. So like and subscribe. Um, I'm thrilled to be doing this. I get to examine these sorts of philosophical issues with you, and I like doing it, and it's very interesting. And a lot of times I get a subject like this that I have to do days worth of research to really truly feel like I've understood it, and I like that. So I'm learning in this process, and that's always the point. So thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe. I hope you join me again. This has been Eric explaining Language, Truth, and Logic by AJ Ayer.